Despite Sammy Hagar's outward success in the 70s and 80s eights, his band was actually experiencing internal strife at the time. If anyone wants to know what happened with Eddie Van Halen, Hagar is more than willing to spill the beans. Join us as we reminisce about the events within the legendary Van Halen band that led to Sammy Hagar's decision to expose Eddie Van Halen's darker side. When Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar formed Van Halen, it was among the most famous and successful periods in rock music history. In 1985, Hagar succeeded David Lee Roth as the band's lead singer. Their collaboration began with this. Everything changed when Hagar became a member of Van Halen. Internal strife and a shift in the music industry were the causes of the band's recent struggles. Even though Eddie's legendary guitar playing had cemented his place in music history, he was eager to find a fresh direction for the band. Famed solo artist and ex-lead singer of the band Montrose, Sammy Hagar, brought a fresh perspective and a unique vocal style that harmonized beautifully with Eddie's playing. Both listeners and critics loved their debut album 5150, 1986, together. Compared to their earlier work, this album was more polished and radio-friendly, yet it retained Van Halen's signature wild energy. Hits like Why Can't This Be Love and Dreams showcased Hagar's powerful vocals and songwriting abilities, enhanced by Eddie's impeccable guitar work. The album was a smashing success, solidifying the band's position in rock history and attracting new listeners to Van Halen. Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, 1991, and AU 812, 1988, were among the many albums that reached #1 after 5150. These albums maintained the band's popular commercial rock sound, and they performed extensively during their peak popularity in the 80s and 90s. Eddie and Sammy clearly had a terrific rapport on stage, and the songs they co-wrote propelled Van Halen to even greater heights of fame. However, tensions were rising behind the scenes, and the dynamics within the band began to shift, even though they were performing well as a unit. Collaboration between Eddie Van Halen and Sammy Hagar initially appeared to be a brilliant idea. The band was a defining moment in rock history thanks to Eddie's innovative guitar riffs and Sammy's commanding vocals. After David Lee Roth departed Van Halen in the mid-1980s, the band began searching for a replacement lead vocalist. It seemed like Sammy Hagar would be a good match. Sammy injected Van Halen with fresh enthusiasm and vocal prowess, catapulting them to new heights of success. Upon his arrival in 1985, the band's sound was transformed and their place in rock history was solidified. With the release of album 5150, songs like Dreams and Why Can't This Be Love ushered in a new era for the band, and the album's massive success propelled them into it. Despite the financial success, Hagar's addition to Van Halen brought new issues that ultimately forced the band to reevaluate their collaboration. The group obviously took cues from Eddie Van Halen, who revolutionized rock music with his incredible guitar work and groundbreaking ideas. However, issues within the group began to arise as a result of his growing personal problems. Eddie's perfectionist tendencies were causing problems, as Hagar was well known for her diligence and professionalism. With the rise to fame of Van Halen, Eddie's antics began to strain the band's relationships. Eddie began to experience stress as a result of the constant pressure to maintain his success and produce new hits. It became evident that his struggles with alcohol and later other personal matters were impacting his interactions with the other members of the band. Sammy, ever the optimist, attempted to keep the energy high, but Eddie's irritability was getting to be too much. Despite the success of albums like 5150, OU 812, and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, the relationship between Hagar and Eddie deteriorated with each subsequent album and tour. Sammy had always had a soft spot for music, but Eddie's sudden actions were driving him crazy. Later on, Hagar would bring up how Eddie's erratic mood swings were a major problem at work. He didn't sugarcoat the fact that the band struggled to perform as a unit due to Eddie's unpredictable mood swings. Sammy was committed to delivering top-notch music, but Eddie appeared to be drifting apart, and his conduct was growing increasingly unstable. An increasingly irate Eddie was a telltale indicator that their relationship was deteriorating. Hagar recounted several instances in which Eddie lost it while recording or practicing. It was challenging for Hagar to work in this environment because she was someone who valued efficiency. An artistic friendship that had been strong between Eddie and Hagar had begun to deteriorate. Eddie was becoming increasingly unreceptive to Sammy's creative suggestions and was becoming increasingly difficult to collaborate with effectively. Evidently, a great deal of stress was involved. Hagar later revealed that his personal and professional lives were negatively impacted by his continual mental fluctuations. The band's internal strife became public knowledge despite Van Halen's success. The public could no longer turn a blind eye to the escalating tensions and violence occurring behind the scenes. The 1991 For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge tour became famous for its increasingly difficult working conditions. The band's continued success couldn't hide the mounting tension between Hagar and Eddie. Sammy expressed his dissatisfaction with not feeling included in the band's creative process, particularly regarding the composition of their songs. During subsequent discussions, he worried that Eddie was resuming command of the ship without consulting Sammy and was instead pursuing his own agenda. Sammy Hagar opted to depart from Van Halen in 1996, following yet another trying period of touring and recording. His desire to depart was fueled by both their creative differences and the disintegration of their relationship. When Sammy's frustrations finally burst, it was after years of strain, and he made his departure known to all. Sammy stated that he had exhausted all possible means to resolve the issues, but that he had done his best to make it work. He said that, despite everything that had been accomplished, business as usual could not continue. A watershed moment in rock history occurred when Sammy left. It was a watershed moment for Van Halen when a key member departed. Following the breakup with Eddie and Van Halen, Sammy Hagar enjoyed a successful solo career, while Eddie and Van Halen continued to collaborate with other vocalists. Still, Hagar and Eddie clearly had a riff, and the two of them never got along again. The underlying tension persisted throughout their years of collaboration, and the relationship remained fraught for a long time after Sammy departed. Everyone was left to speculate about Sammy's departure, with many pointing to Eddie's escalating problems and behavior as the reason. During the talks, Hagar expressed his frustration with Eddie and how their work relationship had become difficult due to Eddie's emotional instability. Eddie and Sammy maintained a strained relationship for a while after that, but they occasionally discussed their relationship status. Eddie felt depressed in the years following Sammy's departure due to his own issues, including substance misuse and health issues. Changes in rock history began with Sammy Hagar's departure from Van Halen. While Hagar and Eddie's collaboration was a hit with fans and music lovers, their professional relationship was anything but smooth sailing. When Van Halen was at the height of their popularity with Hagar, Sammy had a number of issues, both personal and professional, and eventually left the band. Hagar maintained throughout that he left the band due to his extreme dissatisfaction with its direction. So it made no difference whatever happened. He came out and said that he decided to concentrate on his own music and art because working with Eddie was so difficult. His departure from Van Halen put a damper on an otherwise hopeful tale, a tragic breakup followed by unforgettable rock songs. That is the story of Sammy Hagar and Van Halen. The 1985 edition of Sammy Hagar to Van Halen was widely regarded as a brilliant move. Hagar brought a fresh surge of enthusiasm to a band with his vivacious personality and powerful voice. Despite the fact that both David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen were about to become famous, they had been feuding for years. Before Hagar arrived, Roth had been the lead singer, but problems at home and in the office had already begun to plague Van Halen. Something had to give in the band because of how everything was shifting. The addition of Hagar breathed fresh life into the band. Eddie nailed it with his powerful, high-pitched voice and horn drum guitar riffs. The combination of Sammy's passion for music and Eddie's incredible guitar skills created magic that resulted in some of Van Halen's most popular songs, including Why Can't This Be Love?, Jump, and Dreams. The collaboration was a huge success, and everyone from fans to the band members to the media was really impressed. Their sound was obviously a hybrid of the band's earlier and more modern influences, making it suitable for both longtime listeners and newcomers. Their records, such as 5150 and OU 812, were commercial successes, and the band's fame was reignited worldwide. On the other hand, chaos was brewing in the background. The band's sound was conceptualized by Eddie Van Halen, but he was becoming increasingly difficult to collaborate with. It was deeply personal, and it wasn't simply the music that infuriated people. Although the band was aware of Eddie's drug problems, it was his unusual behavior that caused tension. Being the consummate professional that he was, Sammy approached life and music with an optimistic and driven outlook. He wished he could keep the band's energy up and their creativity flowing, but Eddie's erratic behavior, increasing rage, and mood swings were stifling the creative process. Sammy experienced the sensation of dragging a heavy boulder uphill. After they were successful, Sammy realized that Eddie and his vision for Van Halen were very different. Sammy was determined to maintain the band's professionalism and move forward because of his extensive experience in the music industry. The importance of being consistent, working hard, and focusing on the skill was paramount to him. However, Eddie had his own issues to attend to at the moment. He was different from the guy who added so much personality to the early Van Halen songs. His own issues with addiction were beginning to manifest, and he exhibited less consistent behavior. The strain was evidently making Sammy feel worse, despite his best efforts to cope. At the balance meetings in the early 90s, things started to fall apart even more dramatically. Even though Sammy was a good team player in the past, he felt things were getting out of hand with Eddie. Getting along with Eddie on the recording session wasn't always easy. The band wasn't cooperating, and there were furious arguments and disagreements about the direction the music should take. Things were getting worse in the band, and Eddie seemed too busy with his own life to listen to Sammy's pleas that they concentrate on creating music with lasting value. Everything fell apart in 1996 when Sammy Hagar was finally let go from the band. His relationship with Eddie had deteriorated to the point where it had become personal rather than professional. Sammy had been instrumental in Van Halen's success, but he was exhausted from leading the band. Sammy couldn't continue working in an environment that had grown poisonous for him, which is why he was fired for reasons other than disagreements over style. I needed to separate from the band for my own safety. And it wasn't merely a business decision. Everything revolved around Sammy's departure from Van Halen. Their demise shocked fans who were perplexed by the disbandment of such a formidable group. To give Sammy credit, he had considered leaving for a long time. He could perceive the cracks in the structure, such as the arguments between himself and Eddie and the toxic environment that had developed within the band. In subsequent interviews, Sammy expressed his continued admiration for the music they had created, but his inability to collaborate with individuals who were limiting his creativity and allowing their own issues to hinder their achievement. It wasn't only about the music. The feud also centered on the band's management and the future of the music that fans had come to expect. The aftermath of Sammy's departure took some time to materialize. For a while, Eddie Van Halen even brought in new vocalists, like Gary Cherone of Extreme, in an effort to keep the band together. However, the enchantment that Sammy had assisted Eddie and her in creating had vanished. If Sammy weren't a part of Van Halen, the band's sound would be completely different. Not only did the audience notice the shift, but Eddie and the bandmates also had to accept the reality that they were a different entity. When Sammy left Van Halen, it was the end of an age. Publicity had finally brought the long simmering tension to a head. The band disbanded while Sammy Hagar remained a member of Van Halen. The era of rock music had come to a close. The chemistry, enthusiasm, and success they shared in the 80s and 90s were irreplaceable. The rock community was taken aback by Sammy's departure because he was an integral element of Van Halen's music and their friendship. It was a disappointing conclusion to what had been an initially promising chapter. The question that remained for fans was what would have happened if the band could have resolved their differences and continued to create music as a unit. Although it was a major headache, Sammy Hagar's departure from Van Halen marked the beginning of a fresh chapter in his life. Even after he left Van Halen, he continued to play music, build a successful solo career, and leave an indelible mark on the industry. But for many, the era of Van Halen that Sammy fronted in the 80s and 90s will forever be the pinnacle of rock music. Whatever would have transpired if Eddie and Sammy could have resolved their disagreements and continued creating music together remains an open question. Even if we'll never know for sure, their work as Van Halen is widely considered a watershed moment in rock music history, and the music they created together remains popular today. Van Halen's history, particularly that of the band during Sammy Hagar's tenure as lead singer, remains an integral component of rock canon, even in the modern era. The iconic sound of the band, their massive hits, and the dynamic onstage chemistry between Sammy and Eddie will live on in the hearts of music fans forever. Despite their evident success, thinking back on their time working together brings back feelings of regret and makes one wonder what might have been different had they avoided the numerous conflicts and misunderstandings that plagued their collaboration. Everyone has had time to reflect on the band's past, their level of creativity, and the unresolved issues that led to Sammy Hagar's departure since Eddie Van Halen's untimely death. Anyone thinking about the 80s and 90s S&90s is sure to picture Van Halen. Fronted by Sammy Hagar, their collaborative effort was a watershed moment in that era's music history due to the intensity, passion, and commitment it displayed in creating groundbreaking rock music. Their friendship was the secret ingredient to Van Halen's success, and Sammy's powerful and adaptable voice became synonymous with some of their most beloved songs, including Why Can't This Be Love?, Dreams, Jump, and Panama. These songs weren't merely hits, they were anthems for a generation. It seemed like they were destined for even greater things, and no one could stop them. Members of the band continued to bicker, and listeners to the music often failed to notice. But the truth is that Sammy and Eddie's relationship deteriorated as they recorded 5150, their debut album together. Even though they worked wonders in the studio, their individual personalities began to shine through. As talented as Eddie was as a guitarist, he was also very visionary. Contrarily, Sammy was more dynamic, ambitious, and methodical in his approach. These distinctions didn't appear significant at first, but they widened the chasm between the business partners over time. The band's continued success was important to Sammy, but Eddie's drug use and other personal issues began to interfere with his job and relationships with the rest of the band. After that, there were numerous disagreements over aesthetics, as well as escalating tensions and hostility between the two groups. Sammy considered this more than a job. It was his family,